Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety. Today we are sitting down with Dr. Jud Brewer, addiction psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and New York Times bestselling author of Unwinding Anxiety. Dr. Brewer is the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, where he and his team study how habits form in the brain and how we can actually rewire the loops that keep us stuck.
He introduced us to the idea of anxiety as a habit loop, meaning worry becomes a learned behavior, and developed practical tools rooted in mindfulness and neuroscience to break free from craving cycles, whether that craving is for alcohol, nicotine, food, distraction, or certainty.
Welcome, Dr. Brewer.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So let's get into it. So how did you first get interested in the brain and behavior change and why humans do what they do?
Well, it was my own suffering. I had pretty bad anxiety in college. Didn't even know that it was anxiety because I was so divorced from my own body. I wrote about that a bit in my Unwinding Anxiety book, but also started getting panic attacks in residency when I was training to be a psychiatrist. And I got interested in learning about this from my own meditation practice, where I realized that I had no idea how my mind worked. I went to a good medical school in residency, but really did not get that foundational training in here's how the mind works. And so when I started practicing as a psychiatrist, was really struggling to help my patients that this won't be a surprise to a lot of people, but the medications weren't cutting it for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
For example, with anxiety, it's only about 1 in 5 people that shows a significant reduction in symptoms. So I was basically playing the medication lottery. Didn't know which one of the next 5 patients that I saw was going to win and what to do with the other 4. So I joke, I was getting anxious about how to treat my patients with anxiety. And at the time, my lab, I was at Yale at the time, was studying habit change and started to see how both in my clinical practice, a lot of my patients were talking about the same addictive habit loops. I was working at the VA hospital, working with a lot of patients with anxiety and a lot of patients with a lot of different addictions. I was working in the addiction clinic and started to see an overlap and, started doing research on, smoking cessation. And then that translated to the findings that we were getting there. Like, for example, we did a study where we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. And so, and this was using mindfulness training. And so that was translating into eating, and we were getting good results there. And then we started to see how, something that I had never learned in residency had been suggested back in the 1980s by a psychologist named Thomas Borkovic, that anxiety could be driven in the same way. And so, it was a big aha moment for me, seeing that I know something about habits and how they work in the brain and how we can develop treatments for them, but I never thought to apply that to anxiety. And so it started just translating from one to the next, and also circling back because we see a lot of comorbidity with anxiety and addiction, for example. So I had a grad student who's now a postdoc with me, Dr. Bill Nardi, who did a lot of really great work in kind of bridging those siloed gaps between anxiety and addiction. So just that's kind of how it's evolved over the last several decades.
Can I ask you about yourself when you were in residency and you were starting to have panic attacks? Did you already have a mindfulness practice then, or did you start adopting it as you started learning more, or how did that come about?
That's a great question. I started meditating my first day of medical school. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So the full story there is that I had been engaged to my college sweetheart. We were probably not meant to be together, so we broke up, and I, kind of lost my best friend, and she wasn't particularly happy with me for that, and, understandably. And so I was really stressed out at the beginning of medical school, and somehow this Jon Kabat-Zinn book lands in my lap, and, it was a new chapter in my life, starting medical school. And so I decided, well, here's a good time to start. So this is back in the mid-90s. So I started meditating my first day of medical school and never looked back.
Was it full Catastrophe Living?
Indeed it was, yeah.
Jon Kabat-Zinn?
And there were these things called cassette tapes. I don't know if you...
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, so I listened to his cassette tapes that came with the book. And I joked with him because I ended up working at the Mindfulness Center that he founded a while later. that I would fall asleep listening to these meditations for a while, being a sleep-deprived medical student, but then, stopped falling asleep and started really benefiting from these practices.
I grew up with that book on my father's bookshelf.
Mm.
And so I started leafing through that when I was about 10 years old.
Nerd.
Didn't I
It's a
know, I am.
tome. That thing is thick.
I know, but that's I got that book. Yeah.
Wow. Precocious 10-year-old. I love it.
I didn't start practicing though until much later, but I was like, what is this? Full catastrophe living.
But I'm jealous, Dr. Brewer, because when I started dental school, I started drinking, not, mindfulness or meditating. And so that was my way of dealing with stress.
Mhm.
So you said you were drawn to understanding why people get stuck in repeating these same behaviors. So what other early experiences shaped that curiosity for you?
Well, I think I was always been a curious kid. I'd always take my toys apart to see how they worked. And I learned that's harder to put them back together than it is to take them apart. But also, that kind of translated into in college, I loved chemistry for some reason, just these molecules of life. I was really fascinated by how these things, these chemicals contributed to thoughts. And, we don't even go to the consciousness thing, which is still fascinating to me, felt experience. How does that work? And with my, with my patients, just looking at how they were just stuck in these repetitive cycles. It was just always fascinated by how we kind of back ourselves into a corner. It's not like, and I don't want to say it's our fault, because I think there are all these social determinants of health that are critically important, but they also create the conditions for us to get stuck in repetitive cycles of thinking, for example. And then on top of that, we blame ourselves for having those thought patterns when they're not our fault.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this then spirals into shame and guilt and all of this, which then gets self-medicated. If we want to go down the addiction angle, it gets self-medicated, which then feeds back and makes everything worse. That is a fascinating, it could be seen as a morass or a mess, but to me, like, that's a puzzle to be solved. I love it.
Well, I mean, for those of you who are new to your work, can you explain a little bit about the habit loop in plain language and where craving fits inside of it? I remember so I had said to you before we started, I did your program, Eat Right Now. And I remember there was this graphic of this like snake, like with this habit loop. And that stays in my mind. But can you explain what the habit loop is in plain language?
Sure. So this is the most evolutionarily conserved learning process known in science. Full stop, right? So sea slugs, which only have 20,000 neurons, form memories the same way as humans through this process, which is described as reinforcement learning. And so that snake represents where two flavors. One is positive reinforcement, meaning if we do something that feels pleasant, our brain's going to learn to do it again if it's reproducible. And if we do something that avoids something that's unpleasant, our brain's going to learn to do that as well, because it's more pleasant to avoid the unpleasant, if that makes sense. And those are the positive and negative reinforcement loops that form. Now, it makes sense, take addiction. If somebody has a drink, for example, and for them, their genetics, because it's interesting if you look at the genetic aspect of things, not everybody reacts to alcohol the same way, as an example.
Yeah.
But for people that have a certain genetic predisposition, they might get a buzz and that feels good, or it might relieve some. So there's the positive reinforcement. For somebody else, they might drink and it helps decrease that social, if they're socially anxious, and it might decrease that social anxiety, whereas it's often described as the social lubricant, right? Alcohol being that social lubricant. So those are just examples using alcohol where we can get both positive and negative reinforcement with that. And if you break it down, it really takes three elements to form any habit. So it's a trigger, a behavior, and a result. We can use alcohol as an example. We can also use this very paradoxical one of anxiety, where the feeling of anxiety, that physical sensation of nervousness, can lead to the mental behavior of worrying. And that mental behavior of worrying is feels like it gives us a control. And I'm going to be very clear here, the illusion of control, because
Yes, the
right,
illusion.
because anxiety is about fear of the future, and we don't have control over the future by definition because it's not in the present moment. Yet that illusion of like, oh, I'm solving a problem or I'm at least doing something by worrying about it feels better than wallowing in that very unpleasant feeling of anxiety. Anxiety is this evolutionary bottleneck between, fear, which helps us learn in the present moment because something's dangerous is happening and we can learn not to do that again. And also planning, which is based on the future, but it's about setting up a plan, which also is helpful. If you mush those together, you get fear and future. Fear of the future equals anxiety. And that just leads us down this evolutionary bottleneck where we get stuck thinking that worrying's helping, but in fact, it's actually driving more anxiety. So there's an example of negative reinforcement that is based on a false promise that it's going to help us. And I've seen a lot of patients be very attached to their worry and their anxiety just because they've been so used to it. They feel like this is who they are or somehow it helps until they really start unpacking it. And just to give you an example, we did a randomized controlled trial where we trained people in mindfulness using the app-based mindfulness training. And we got a 67% reduction in anxiety relative to only 14% in people with usual clinical care when we specifically taught them about that as a habit loop and how to unwind it. So, this isn't just, it sounds nice. The theory is solid because we see both efficacy, in clinical trials. We've done several randomized controlled trials now, but we also see mechanism. We can see that mindfulness specifically leads to an increase in the ability to be with our emotions. Think of it as distress tolerance, which reduces the worry, which then has direct effects on anxiety.
And I would assume that even just the awareness of the habit loop, knowing that this is what's happening. I mean, I'm a psychotherapist, so I know awareness is a huge piece of it, right? Is that once we're aware, we can actually look at it differently. In fact, we can also get some distance in a sense from it.
Absolutely. Right. So by, think of it as the Hawthorne effect or the observer effect. I wrote a Substack on this because I think it's really helpful to recognize that by observing our experience, we can't simultaneously be identified with it, right? Or as identified. So the observation gives us perspective where we can see, oh, that's a thought as compared to that's me. Tons of patients who feel like they come to me and say, I'm anxious. And I say, well, what's it like to feel like, that identification, I am anxious versus I'm a person who experiences anxiety. Very different, just even in that framing and that recognition.
Very different. I think the one I use a lot with my clients and myself is I'm noticing the sensation of anxiety or I'm noticing anxiety. I use it all the time with my clients. They're like, yeah, Kathleen.
Well, you use it on me and your daughter, who's 11. She's like, what are you noticing? What are you noticing?
I love it.
And it's like, Kathleen, stop therapizing me.
I can't help it sometimes. So you often talk about reward value, like how the brain learns what feels good or bad. Why do we keep returning to habits that we know hurt us long term?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
It comes back to that word, habit. So at some point, the behavior that we've done that becomes a habit has to have been rewarding enough that we do it again. That's kind of how, the definition of how a habit forms. It's got to be rewarding to some degree. But once we lay it down as a habit, also by definition, a habit is something that we do automatically. So we're not paying attention to how rewarding it is. And that frees up our brain actually to learn other things. If, habits, most of the habits we do are very helpful. And imagine having to relearn everything every habit that we have every day. We'd be exhausted before breakfast, whether it's learning how to walk or make coffee or whatever. So habits by and large are very helpful. There are just some of them that get set up at some point in life that then become no longer helpful for us, or we've associated them with utility. And now we see that they're really not useful. I'm thinking of a patient that I had who was in his 60s and had worried his whole life. And he had, as a kid, he had been abused, and the only coping mechanism he had at the time was to worry, because that was the thing he had control over, because he didn't have control over his situation. He was a kid. And what we talked through was how he needed to honor his childhood self, like you did the best that you could, and also to recognize that the worrying was not serving him. He was now in his 60s. And so we talked about it in terms of this pair of shoes that he had put on that seemed to have fit at the time. And now not only were they worn out, but they were hurting his feet, hurting his brain, hurting his soul. And when he could recognize that, so honor his childhood self, but also recognize that these shoes hurt, the natural thing to do was to take them off.
That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of that, Dr. Brewer, can you explain what disenchantment is and how does it help update the brain's reward database so that these unhelpful habits start to lose their pull?
This is probably the $1 trillion question, because if we look at how most people approach habit change, it's willpower. When you tell me if your experience is different working, yourselves or with clients, but it's kind of like, whether it's a diet program, trying to quit smoking, trying to stop worrying, all of this is, we'll use your willpower. This actually, I love that there's a great skit from Bob Newhart from the 1970s called Stop It, which is, if you haven't seen it, it is worth the 5 minutes. But he is making fun in a very poignant way. I don't know if poignant is the right word, but he's really pointing out back in the 70s, this is when CBT was really coming, building steam. And he was saying, how are we supposed to use these cognitive skills to kind of think our way out of anxiety? And he really nailed it with this skit of Stop It. And so the reason I highlight that is that often the approach, whatever it is that we're trying to change, is to use our willpower. Well, from a neuroscience standpoint, willpower is more myth than muscle. It's not actually in the equations that account for both habit formation and habit change. So that's kind of important to point out. And this gets at the disenchantment question that you just asked, which is, there are well-established mechanisms for how habits form, and we've talked about them. This is the positive and negative reinforcement piece. Once something establishes a certain reward value in our brain, we're going to generally not pay attention to how rewarding it is. And so what we need to do is check in to see, is it still as rewarding as it was before? If we don't do that, then we're just going to keep doing it. And we're going to do a big willpower faceplant, because we're going to think, oh, I just need to stop doing this. And then we can't. And then we're told that there's a failure on our part. And then we get into the shame spirals. That doesn't help either.
Mm-hmm.
So here, I'll use a couple of examples. One is with smoking. With my patients who've struggled to quit smoking, their willpower, for some reason, doesn't work for them because it's more myth than muscle. What I have them do is pay attention as they smoke. And at first, it seems paradoxical. Did I hear my doc correctly? He's telling me to smoke. I'm not telling them to smoke. They're already smoking, for the record. But I am asking them to get curious and notice what it tastes like, what it feels like, what it smells like. And they come back to me blown away, because they're like, how did I not notice that these things taste like crap? Well, it's because they're not paying attention, because our brains tend to avoid things that are unpleasant, and cigarettes are generally unpleasant. When they start bringing that awareness back in, they see, feel, taste, smell that cigarettes just aren't that great, and they become disenchanted with them, because you can't unsee, feel, taste, smell what reality is. You can ignore it for a while, but when you really pay attention, your body is going to tell you everything that you need to know, which is, as one of my patients said, all the cigarettes I smoked were disgusting. Right? It's not like one of them's going to taste good. Maybe this one, maybe this one. Nope. They all taste and smell the same. That's why, You layer them with menthol. That's why you do all these things to try to, decrease the ickiness of them. And this is also where vaping comes in, where they've tried to really reduce the negative qualities of nicotine. So that's an example of smoking. We can do the same thing with overeating, for example. We did a study with overeating where we had people pay attention as they overate. You ready for this? It only took 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention as they overate for that reward value to drop below 0. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it makes sense. Our brains need to be very adaptable because our environment is changing, all the time. And if we are not good at adapting, if we're very rigid, then it's going to be hard. We're going to resist change. And anytime we resist change, let's just say it doesn't go well. You can only resist so long. And I'm sure Kathleen and anybody can appreciate this, right? What we resist persists, right? That's like the old adage that we learn in graduate school. And so by resisting change, we're actually making things worse and prolonging the experience. So here, when people pay attention, their body's going to tell them, ugh, it doesn't feel good when I stuff myself, right? We feel they're all the things that people describe, and none of them are pleasant. It's just that we tend to ignore the experience and then we repeat it because it's a habit. So that's my long answer to your short question around what disenchantment is and how important it is. This is really the critical aspect for any type of behavior change. If we don't become disenchanted, let me back up. If we don't pay attention to the actual results of an experience, we don't become disenchanted with it and we can't change it. Like all of the research supports that in our studies and other people's studies. And people can look at this for themselves because if they, there's going to be something in the back of their brain saying, oh, no, it wasn't that bad, and trying to convince them to do it again. And it's only when we have gone down that road so many times that we really see, oh, this really isn't doing it for me, that we become disenchanted. This is where, all these sayings in addiction treatment, like people hitting rock bottom, all these phrases come from that specific aspect and how critical it is. It's also, if you look at 12 steps, you look at, having to take that inventory, right? That inventory isn't a pleasant experience. It's not supposed to be, but it really helps people retrospectively look back at all of the results of that behavior so that they can then really feel into that and get the experience like, wow, this didn't do it for me. I'll give one more example. I had a patient who came to me when she was about 50 and had been drinking since her 20s, had very severe anxiety. As she described it, she used to pre-party to go to the grocery store. That's how bad her social anxiety was. And her drinking was pretty severe. She was getting some very negative results with her teenage kids. All this stuff that happens, embarrassment and all this. And so what I had her start exploring was, what was it like the morning that she woke up after having a bender versus morning when she woke up sober? And she could start to differentiate these pretty clearly, where she, it's like her kids were not embarrassed. They, wanted to speak with her, all these things when she was sober. And then there were all these negative things that came from being intoxicated. And every morning she would wake up and she'd reflect on that and ask, okay, what's it like now being sober? What was it like before, as a way to remind herself, this is what I got from drinking. And, it really helped her get on the road and stay on the road of sobriety for her. That's really what she needed. And that's a great example of the power of disenchantment. She could really feel into that experience and also remember and recall what it was like in the past, so she didn't need to repeat it. She could just recall it, and that recollection was enough of an ick to not want to do it again.
So is that what you're describing, that loop and that interruption of the loop with disenchantment, is that the same for all substances, including food, and also for process-based addictions like online behavior, sex, gambling? And Kathleen and I talk about this a lot because she struggles with sugar, and we'll walk into a cafe and I'll be like, oh my God, that croissant looks amazing. And she's like, did you just really say that? And I'm like, you know what? You're right. Is it the same as if Kathleen says to me, oh, this glass of red wine is amazing. Too bad you can't have any. So are those things equivalent? Are food, alcohol, sex, gambling, is this all part of the same loop?
It is, in short. And we have a nonprofit called Mind Shift Recovery that has a free app for anybody that struggling with any, and I mention this because is for people struggling with any of these things. We specifically are highlighting the commonalities with, and it's funny you mentioned these: gambling, sex, food, anxiety, and other substances, and digital addiction as well. So the process is the same, and it also highlights how, extreme examples like cigarettes, like there's nothing healthy about a cigarette, right? So we can see how that's a pretty straightforward addiction to break free of, but we all have to eat to survive, right? And it's not to say that we should try to ban ourselves from using our phones, because that's just impractical. Let's put it that way. Me trying to navigate the streets of Boston without a smartphone, good luck. And you're like, where was Jud? Well, he went into Boston without his phone, and we've never seen him since. Like it's nuts there. So this is where we get to explore what I think of as the pleasure plateau, where, let's use food as an example. When we're really hungry and we eat a type of food, it's going to taste different than when we're not hungry. And we can actually pay attention as we eat with each bite and ask ourselves, is this more pleasurable, the same, or less pleasurable than the last bite? And we can do this in real time. Anybody can do this. All they need to do is be hungry and find a type of food that is not disgusting, right? Don't take the food that you hate. It's like, I'm gonna try this with Vegemite or Marmite or something. It's like some people really don't like that type of food. So here's where we can really be exploring this with any experience, whether it's food, whether it's social media. I have patients explore this. If they're stuck on the doom scroll, they can ask themselves, well, okay, what do I get? If I've had a hard day, I just need a 5-minute break. I'm going to go look at pictures of, videos of puppies on Instagram. There's nothing wrong. And I have to say, cute puppies and kittens, there's a lot of right there.
Yeah.
I love the kitten videos on Instagram. But if we're doing that as a way to avoid life, and we're scrolling for 15 minutes, then 30 minutes, then 2 hours, and we're going to that every time we have something that's unpleasant, now we've learned to avoid life rather than lean into it. And so we can go on the pleasure plateau there and ask, okay, when is this helpful as a 5-minute just reset for my brain? Because kittens are a great reset for the brain. Versus when am I doing this as an avoidance strategy when it's not so helpful for me? And then apply that to sex, apply that to gambling. I'm not sure that gambling is ever helpful, but gambling is probably more in the smoking category, in terms of how much money people actually make long-term, negative. That's the point of the gambling, the gambling industry, is that it makes a lot of money and people lose a lot of money. But if you look at food, if you look at sex, if you look at a lot of experiences that we have, social media, it's not that they're inherently bad. It's just how we get sucked into them.
It's really interesting. And so kind of want to switch a little bit to talking about mindfulness. And so is that what you're describing? Is that mindfulness as an effective way to interrupt habit loops? And what's happening neurologically when we get curious instead of reactive?
Yeah. Yeah. And so mindfulness can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. So let's use the kind of the core elements just to make sure. I don't want anybody to be confused by this. So what does mindfulness encompass? Typically it's an attitude of curiosity and a present moment awareness. So, and we can even just distill that down to curiosity. So when someone is curious, and let's use an example, let's use social media. When somebody is noticing that they're stressed out, there's the trigger, their behavior is to go on social media and scroll, they can get curious about that and ask, oh, what do I get from scrolling on social media? What do I get from scrolling for 5 minutes when I just need a brain reset? Could just be fine, no problem. What do I get when I go there to avoid my experience all the time, right? And they can start to see that it's not very rewarding. So that curiosity comes in to help people really be with their direct experience. And then it can help us step out of these loops. So when we're feeling anxious, for example, if anxiety is what drives us to go on social media and scroll, we can compare what it feels like, let's say, to worry or to doom scroll or to do some type of avoidance strategy versus just getting curious about what that anxiety feels like itself. And I'm guessing a lot of people, a lot of, well, Kathleen, to see if this is how you practice in your psychotherapy practice, a lot of good psychotherapists will help people learn to lean into their direct experience and develop that distress tolerance so they can be with it. Now, that is one of the best skills that anybody can learn, full stop, is being with uncomfortable experiences, both emotionally, whether it's an unpleasant thought, unpleasant body sensation, etc. Once we can learn to be with these, we can learn to avoid avoidance, as in lean into it instead of running away from our experience. And that's curiosity, I think of as a superpower in that way, which also functions very closely with its close cousin, kindness, where we can start to see when we get in these habit loops of judging ourselves, of these shame spirals and all those things, we can do the same thing. We can get curious. Oh, what do I get from beating myself up? Nothing. And what do I get from bringing some kindness in? Oh, that feels much better than judging myself. And it also helps keep my brain online so I can learn to step out of that shame spiral.
Yeah, I do teach it that way. And with my clients, like in terms of the first thing that you mentioned of like, how can we increase our tolerance? Can you walk us through your 3-step like curiosity method for unwinding anxiety and how can we apply it to other addictions?
I'd be happy to. So the first step is just mapping out the habit loop. What's the trigger? What's the behavior? What's the result? And that I would say we can even simplify that to just recognizing what the behavior is. Often people get stuck in looking for the triggers because they want to avoid them. The trigger is the least important part of the equation because it's not what drives future behavior. It's that behavior and the reward relationship that really drives the reinforcement of that habit loop. So just recognizing whatever the behavior is. Is it worrying? Is it avoidance? Is it whatever? The second step is asking, I distill all of this disenchantment, reinforcement learning, neuroscience into a single sentence, which is asking ourselves, what am I getting from this? Right? If we ask this simple question, bringing the attitude of curiosity in and asking, what am I getting from this? If we're smoking a cigarette, we can really notice the results. If we're doom scrolling, we can really notice the results. If we've got a porn addiction, we can really notice the results, whatever it is. And we can start to become disenchanted, not by telling ourselves that we shouldn't be doing this, but really feeling in and seeing the direct experience. That's the critical disenchantment second step. The third step I call finding the bigger, better offer, which is, it could be as simple as stepping out of the old habit loop. And it can also be where we are bringing in and learning to lean into the new habit of being curious and kind. And so we briefly touched on this. When we're worrying, for example, we can compare worry to curiosity. We can see that curiosity feels better than worry. And we can take that, oh no, that comes with worry, and we can replace that with, oh, what does this feel like as we lean into our direct experience? And we learn to see that, there's this phrase attributed to Marcus Aurelius, what stands in the way becomes the way. And so when there's something unpleasant, instead of running away, that becomes the way. We can think, oh, what's this feel like in my experience? And we develop that. We're developing our distress tolerance in real time and reinforcing that as the new habit. So that's the third step, is finding that bigger, better offer. And I would say, generally speaking, the general categories of that, or the main flavors, are kindness and curiosity. So that's the 3 steps. And, this is something that can be applied to anything, any habits, ranging from, any substance to any behavior to, I would say that covers most of experience, whether it's a substance that we consume, ranging from alcohol to food, or a behavior that we do, ranging from social media to porn, to gambling. All of these fall within the same category and can be met with these 3 steps.
And so what about someone, and I say this sometimes, who says, mindfulness doesn't work for me? Where do you start, and what are the small signs that it is starting to work for you, even if you can't see it yet?
Yeah. So let's kind of play this out in real time. So if you can embody someone that might say, mindfulness isn't working for me. So I'd say, okay, Sonia.
Embody. She is that.
All right.
She is.
Perfect. So
It when Kathleen says, just let the emotion pass like a wave, I just get I get violent.
Okay, great. That's maybe jumping right to the 3rd step of thinking mindfulness is going to do the thing that's going to make the other thing go away. And we call this the 1st to 3rd step faceplant. So if somebody says to me, so Sonia's saying to me, oh, mindfulness isn't working for me, I would start with asking you, Sonia, how disenchanted you are with that old behavior. And I would start by bringing that curiosity right to the experience and asking that question. What am I getting from doing X? So if you were to embody that, what would you say?
Mine is real. This is an active
Things
addiction.
can we just do me, because I'm actually we're doing Kathleen.
I'm in recovery from other addictions, which I've been able to work through no problem. But the food, sugar addiction, haven't been able to get through it.
Okay. So let's say, just to play this out, let's use the hypothetical where you say, Jud, mindfulness isn't working for me. Okay.
Yeah.
So then I would ask, okay, with food addiction, just walk me through, do you stress eat? Do you eat at certain times of days? Where is it problematic?
Yeah, I stress eat. I eat out of boredom. I eat. It's really stress eating and out of boredom.
Okay. So let's take the stress eating. Let's bring some curiosity in here. And if you look at the stress eating and ask the question, what am I getting from this? How would you answer that question?
I notice that I am getting a comfort from it in the moment somehow. It feels like comfort. I also have ADHD, so I do think I get a bit of a dopamine hit from it.
Okay.
Maybe. I don't know. And I'd say comfort and for both, for boredom and emotional eating.
Okay. So why don't you do that more?
Why don't I eat it more?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're getting comfort and some dopamine hit. Why not just do that all the time?
Yeah, because at a certain point, I feel extremely gross. I think that it's bad for me. It ruins my sleep. It gives me anxiety. It's not, I'm scared I'm going to get diabetes one day if I keep doing this.
Okay.
The list goes on. I have a long one.
Okay. And so net, would you say, when you ask, what do I get from this? Is that negative list longer than the positive list?
100%.
Okay.
There's 2 things on my positive list. It tastes good in the first few bites and comfort.
Okay. So if you recall that list and you think about, imagine that you have the opportunity to stress eat right now, how excited are you to go and do it again?
Not really, actually.
Okay.
I feel actually sick to my stomach thinking about it.
That is perfect. Not that I want you to feel sick to your stomach, but that recollection highlights how you've developed your disenchantment database. You've built that database, and you can go to that database anytime you want. It's there. It's available. And so here's an opportunity. So that's that second step, right? And I would say, sounds like because you're able to be aware enough retrospectively, you can say, okay, mindfulness is working there because you're able to notice the cause and effect relationship. Now you can apply that in the third step, and this is where I think of it as meeting our needs rather than feeding our wants. And so if it was stress eating, how much did the eating actually solve the stress besides that temporary distraction?
Not at all. It actually brings me more discomfort.
Yeah. Okay. So if you were to really care for yourself, how would you meet that need to deal with the stress?
I think that right now, if I needed comfort and I was stressed, I would like cozy up in a warm blanket and watch some holiday movie.
Gilmore
Okay.
Girls.
No, not Gilmore Girl.
Yeah.
Like Notting Hill or something, like like bring me comfort, or I would call a friend, or like those things, or journal. Those things actually would bring me more long-term comfort.
Long-term comfort. And what's the downside to doing those? Any? I mean, probably if you're in the middle of work,
No.
you can't go and watch a whole episode of Gilmore Girls, right? But
Right.
bringing in and meeting those needs, like you're saying, is that long-term, long-term result that comes that's more, I would guess, is going to help you out more than, feeding the want. But again, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, it's true. It's true. Even like if I'm thinking about it, it's true. My brain will go, I don't have time to do that. And so, but I have time to make a cup of tea, which brings me comfort.
Yeah. So that's where you can ask, okay, well, when I stress eat, it takes this long and these are the results. How can I meet those needs in the same amount of time or less that also gives longer term, better results, right? That's the bigger, better offer of the third step. So that's it. So, if somebody says mindfulness isn't working for me, this is more about bringing that curiosity in and really leaning into each step. And this is where it's helpful to know how our brains work. A little bit of the neuroscience is helpful here, where it demystifies this concept of mindfulness and really puts it into practice. It's very pragmatic.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for using me as a real life example with my real life food addiction struggle.
Yeah. I'll send you a bill
Thank
later.
you.
Yeah.
I know.
Kathleen and
Yeah.
I mean, mostly me, use this platform as just therapy. So
We have our own therapist, but we do really get to interview some amazing people who give us lots of insight for our listeners.
Yeah.
We are going to switch gears a little bit because before you came on, we started recording, we touched on very briefly in our pre-conversation the intersection between AI and mental health.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's something you're passionate about right now. What is interesting to you about that intersection right now?
Well, there are a million things, so I'll keep it very brief. One is that's getting a lot of news is how these models have been trained on reinforcement learning, right? It's such a strong process that they've actually used this for their deep neural networks, they being the industry, where they've literally trained their models on it. And when they've brought in reinforcement learning with human feedback, there's actually a term called RLHF, where people can rate the responses. These things went from, fancy autocomplete sentences to feeling very human-like. The problem is that people are inherently subject to flattery. And so these things were subtly flattering people. And this whole aspect of what's called sycophancy got built into the models and is not getting unbuilt anytime soon, as much as I think the industry is giving some lip service to this, because it really drives, it's a good way to keep people engaged, where you basically telling people that they're great in one way or another. And anybody that's interacted with any of these primary models has experienced it in one form or another. And you can find all these articles about it. So I think that's interesting. And it's a problem. And I also, when you combine this with, there was a Harvard Business Review study earlier this year that showed that the number one use of these out-of-the-box chatbots or large language models, conversational agents, is companionship and therapy. So people are number one use across the world
Oh my
is this
gosh.
type of thing. So people are using these. Yeah. Yes. So let that, give that a beat. So people are using these sycophants as therapy or companionship, which is just reinforcing unhelpful ego habits. Let's just put it that way. We can unpack that more probably over several episodes, but I think everybody gets the idea. So we're my lab, and we also have a program called Going Beyond Anxiety, where we're asking these questions like, how can we skillfully use generative AI, because it's not going away and it's a very powerful system. How can we use it to pair with people, where we deliver good evidence-based, psychotherapeutic components and psychoeducation? Can we use these conversational agents as a way to reinforce concepts? And so we've been exploring basically learning assistants where, you're not getting a chatbot that's being a sycophant. People are getting an evidence-based sequential program, in our Going Beyond Anxiety program, but we layer in learning assistants that will then come in after each lesson and then ask people to explain to it what they learned. And what we're learning is that, people might be a little intimidated, by, here I'm a whatever, over-credentialed person. And so a patient in my clinic might be reticent to come to me and be like, I didn't understand what you just said.
Right.
But they'll tell the bot that. And if the bot asks
Yeah.
them to explain it in their own words, it has the time, where I wish I had the time, but I don't, and none of us do, right? Where we can start to democratize this, where we can make this available to anyone, where they can be working, where they get these didactics that I deliver. We're doing this in a video and audio format, but they can be interacting with these conversational agents as a way to really help them reinforce the concepts, but most importantly, do experiential education, where it says, okay, let's apply this to your life. It becomes an accountability buddy, where it says, let me check in with you. All these things that I wish I could clone myself to do. And I'm sure, we all do as psychotherapists, that where we can be helpful at, at scale, so to speak, or at least at a larger scale than the one-to-one therapy. So that's what we're exploring and are learning a ton, and are already, seeing good results in our Going Beyond Anxiety program.
It's scary for me as a therapist. I have to say, more and more, I'm seeing clients come in to my practice saying, oh, well, I just talked to ChatGPT about this. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm a relationship therapist. So that's also one of the nuances that I have fear about, because people are literally asking for advice on their relationships, which can be so nuanced, right?
Yes.
From AI.
Yes. Yeah. So remember, this thing is trained on the entirety of the internet, which is largely Reddit threads, for the English spoken language.
Right.
And so, it's not to say that these things are terrible. It's just that that's not the first place I would start. Now, if somebody doesn't have access to you, or can't, they've got it, they're running into a struggle, and they're not going to see you for another week, I can see why somebody would lean to the internet, because it's like, here's an instant answer, and it might feel good enough to somebody that isn't trained in this, where they're like, well, that's good enough. Whereas, I think people just need to be really careful, and I can understand why you're concerned about this, because this is really highlighting the limits in terms of availability and affordability and just access to good psychotherapy. Kathleen, there's a bell curve of quality of psychotherapists and even availability and all of that. So this is where we all can lean in and ask, is there a different way? So one, I'm sure it's where the good work that you're doing is really hard to replicate, I think, with the internet. And we can also be thinking about some of these common things like anxiety and asking, this question like, hey, can we just completely reconceptualize how we treat anxiety? Would I send somebody to you if they have a bad habit? No, because I would, give them the skills training to help them unwind that habit. And so here we can even, and amazing if they could unwind some of their unhealthy habits and then come to you for couples therapy, because it's probably going to clean up a lot of stuff. So here's where we can be really skillful about like what is the problem that somebody's coming with? What's the right solution? And it's not just, psychotherapy or just skills training. It's like, how do we triage things effectively? I think we can get much better at that.
I think that it is a really important conversation that we're going to need to continue to have. And I guess for our listeners, I guess I would do a shout out and say, just be aware, be curious. Like, don't be taking things at face value saying, okay, we're going to go to chat. Yes, it can be a tool. I use it in my practice. But are you leaning on it for full companionship? Your answers? Are you, just as we should be aware of, the news we read, it's the same thing. We just need, so I'd say that would be a key message for our listeners, and also to just learn about it, and I think you're starting and doing important work around this.
So since this is Sisters in Sobriety, if there's somebody listening who's struggling with addiction, where can they start with what you offer? I know you have your recovery network, and so where should they start?
I would say they could, from our perspective, we have this Mindshift Recovery program, so they can just go to mindshiftrecovery.org, or they can download the free app. It's just Mindshift Recovery app. And that would be a good place to start if somebody resonates with what we've talked about today. And this is for any type of addiction. That's one thing we're really excited about with this free service, is to support people with any type of addiction.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to have you on. And I've been a follower of your work, Dr. Brewer. So I'm really happy that you were able to come on today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Sure.
It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Okay.